3 hours before my husband died, he opened his eyes, reached for my hand, and whispered something that made no sense to me at the time. He said, "When our son comes here after I'm gone, don't believe the first thing he tells you." I remember staring at him in that hospital room, thinking the medication must have confused him, because our son Michael wasn't cruel. He wasn't dangerous. He was my boy. But 48 hours after the funeral, Michael stood in my kitchen, looked me straight in the eyes, and said something that made my entire body go cold. And suddenly, my husband's final words didn't sound confused at all. His name was Gerald Thomas Whitmore. He was 67 years old when he died, and we had been married for 41 years. 41 years of Sunday morning coffee and burnt toast. 41 years of sharing one bathroom and one checking account and one life. He used to fold the laundry wrong. He'd ball the socks instead of folding them, and for 40 years that little thing drove me quietly crazy. I would have given anything in this world to watch him ball those socks one more time. Gerald had been sick for about 2 years before the end came. It started as something the doctors said was manageable. A heart condition, medication adjustments, lifestyle changes. We handled it the way you handle things when you've been married long enough to know that some storms just need to be weathered quietly, together. We didn't panic. We didn't fall apart. We just adjusted. But the second year was different. The hospitalizations got longer. The weight came off his face in a way that scared me every morning when I looked at him across the breakfast table. He got quieter. Not sad, exactly. Gerald was never a man who sank into sadness, but thoughtful. He'd sit by the window in the late afternoon and just watch the backyard, the bird feeder he'd hung from the oak tree, the garden I never properly tended. He'd watch it all like he was memorizing it. I think he knew. Men like Gerald, steady, private, practical men, they know these things before the doctors confirm them. He never said it out loud, but I knew that he knew, and he knew that I knew. That was the kind of marriage we had. We didn't always need words. The last hospitalization was in October. The leaves were turning outside his room window, and I remember thinking that it was almost too beautiful, the way the world keeps going on being gorgeous, even when you're sitting inside watching your husband disappear. I sat with him every day. I'd bring his reading glasses, even though he wasn't reading much anymore. I'd bring the crossword puzzle from the newspaper, and we'd try a few clues together. And sometimes he'd get one right and smile, and that smile would hold me together for another few hours. Michael came to the hospital a few times. He lived about 3 hours away, up in Columbus, with his wife Dana and their 2 kids. He had a good job something in financial consulting, though honestly I never fully understood what he did. He was busy. He was always busy. That was just Michael. Had been since he was a teenager, always moving, always planning, always looking ahead to the next thing. Gerald used to say that Michael got his ambition from some branch of the family tree neither of them could identify, because neither Gerald nor I had ever been particularly driven by money or status. We just wanted a quiet, honest life. Michael wanted more than that, and we loved him for it, even when it meant he was farther away than we'd have liked. When he visited the hospital, Michael was attentive. He'd ask the nurses good questions. He'd read the charts. He'd sit by Gerald's bed and talk to him about the grandchildren, about sports, about nothing in particular, the comfortable filler conversation of people who love each other but don't always know how to say so directly. Gerald seemed glad to see him, or at least he seemed glad in the way a tired man is glad quietly without a lot of energy to show it. But one evening, after Michael had gone home, Gerald reached over and turned the television off. We'd been watching the evening news, which neither of us was really watching. He turned it off and looked at me for a long moment, and I put down the crossword and looked back at him, and he said very quietly, "How are you doing? Really?" I told him I was fine. I told him I was managing. I told him the way wives tell husbands things half honest, shaped to protect. He nodded slowly, and then he said, I need you to be strong after I'm gone. Stronger than you think you need to be. I wanted to tell him to stop talking like that. I almost did. But something in his eyes told me that this was one of those moments where the kindest thing I could do was listen. There are things about the house, he said. About the accounts. Things I should have explained better. He paused. I should have been more careful about writing things down. I told him we could talk about all of that when he felt stronger. He gave me a look, gentle but a little firm, the kind of look that said, "We both know that's not going to happen." He squeezed my hand. "Whatever Michael tells you needs to be done right away," he said. "Take your time. Don't rush anything." He paused again. "Promise me." I promised. I didn't fully understand what I was promising. I thought it was the morphine making him worry about nothing. I thought it was a sick man's anxiety. 2 days later, 3 hours before he died, he said those final words. "Don't believe the first thing Michael tells you." And then he closed his eyes, and the machines kept beeping, and the nurses came and went. And somewhere around 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in October, Gerald Thomas Whitmore left this world. The funeral was on a Saturday. It rained, which felt right somehow. 50 or 60 people came, neighbors, people from our church, men Gerald had worked with years ago at the plant before he retired. I stood at the front of the room in my black dress, and I shook hands, and I accepted hugs, and I said thank you. Thank you. He was a good man. Yes, he was. Thank you. Michael stood beside me for part of it, and then he'd drift away, and then he'd come back. Dana kept the grandchildren close. Everyone said the right things. After the burial, people came back to the house. I had put out food I'd spent 2 days cooking, which is what I do when I don't know what else to do with my hands, and people ate and talked quietly, and the hours passed the way hours do at those things. Slowly, and then suddenly, all at once. By 7 o'clock, everyone was gone. Michael and Dana and the kids had gone to a hotel nearby because the house only had the one guest room, and it felt strange with Gerald not in our bedroom. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. The house had never been so quiet. Gerald wasn't a loud man, but his presence had a weight to it, a steadiness. And without that weight, the house felt like it was floating a little, like it might drift away if I didn't hold on. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table where we had eaten breakfast together for over 30 years. I looked at his chair across from me, and I talked to him for a little while, quietly, the way you do when you've loved someone long enough that silence and conversation have become the same thing. The next morning, Michael came over early. He had coffee from the drive-through because he knew I wasn't much for making a full breakfast on hard days, and I appreciated that. We sat at the kitchen table, he in Gerald's chair, which I noticed but didn't say anything about, and we talked about the service, about the people who had come, about how the kids had handled it. Normal morning after things. And then he put his cup down and looked at me directly, the way Gerald used to look at me when he had something important to say, and he said, "Mum, I need to talk to you about the house." My body went cold. Not because of what he said exactly, but because of how he said it. There was something prepared about it, something that had been sitting in a pocket, waiting to be pulled out. It didn't sound like a son worried about his mother. It sounded like someone who had been thinking about this conversation for a while. He said that he and Dana had talked it over, had apparently been talking it over for some time, and that they were worried about me being alone in the house. It was a big house for one person. The upkeep was a lot. The neighborhood had changed. He said all of these things in a voice that was warm and careful and measured, and with each sentence, I felt something shift in my chest. He said he thought it might be time for me to think about selling. I sat with that for a moment. Gerald's chair, Gerald's coffee mug still in the drying rack by the sink, because I hadn't been able to put it away. Gerald, 48 hours in the ground. I told Michael that I appreciated his concern, but that this wasn't the time to be talking about selling anything. I told him I needed some time to grieve. He nodded, and he backed off, and I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the following weeks, the calls started. Michael called every few days, which should have been a comfort. And in some ways it was, because grief is lonely, and the sound of your child's voice is never nothing. But there was always a pivot, a few minutes of "how are you?" and then a gentle turn toward the practical. Had I thought any more about the house? Had I called a financial advisor? Did I know what was in the accounts? Did I have a clear picture of what everything was worth? I told him I was handling things. My attorney, a kind older woman named Patricia Hess, who Gerald and I had used for years, was helping me work through the estate. Everything was in order. Gerald had not been a careless man. The house was paid off. The accounts were modest but sufficient. There was a life insurance policy. I was not going to be in any kind of trouble. But Michael kept asking questions, detailed questions, specific questions. The kind of questions that didn't quite feel like a son checking on his mother's well-being. They felt like, and I hate that this thought entered my mind, because this was my child, my boy. They felt like questions someone asks when they're trying to get an accurate count of something. I want to be clear about something, because I don't want to tell this story in a way that makes me sound like a foolish woman who should have seen everything coming. I didn't have those suspicions right away. The mind resists them. When you have loved someone their entire life, when you have held them as a baby, and watched them walk and sat in the front row at their high school graduation, when you have 1,000 memories of who they are at their best, the mind resists the idea that something underneath might be different than you thought. It resists hard. It should resist. Love requires that kind of faith. So I told myself it was just Michael being Michael. Practical. Organized. He liked to have things sorted. That was a good quality, I told myself. That was responsible. Then Dana called me one afternoon in November, about 3 weeks after the funeral. She was warm, as Dana always was. Dana had always been a kind woman. I want to say that clearly. And she said she'd been thinking about me and wanted to check in. We talked for a while about the kids, about Thanksgiving coming up. And then she said gently, "Michael mentioned you haven't made any decisions about the house yet." Something in me stiffened. Not because Dana was wrong to ask, but because of the phrase "hadn't made any decisions yet," as if decisions needed to be made, as if there was a timeline I was behind on. I said I wasn't planning on making any hasty decisions. Dana said, of course. No one was asking me to be hasty. She said something about the market being favorable right now, that it might be worth at least getting an appraisal, just to know where things stood. She said a friend of Michael's was in real estate and could come by whenever I was ready, no pressure. I thanked her and got off the phone and sat in the living room for a while in the quiet. That evening, I got out a notepad. I have always been a person who writes things down when I'm trying to think clearly, and I wrote down everything I could remember about what Michael had said, and when, and what Dana had said, and the sequence of it. And when I looked at what I'd written, something became clear that I hadn't let myself see before. This wasn't concern. This was a campaign. And I remembered what Gerald had said. Don't believe the first thing he tells you. Gerald hadn't said, don't trust Michael. He hadn't said Michael was dangerous or dishonest. He'd said, don't believe the first thing he tells you. And the first thing Michael had told me, the opening argument, the frame for everything that followed, was that I needed to sell the house. I thought about Gerald, sitting by the window in those last months, watching the backyard, being thoughtful. I thought about him saying he should have written things down more carefully. I thought about him asking me to promise not to rush anything. Gerald had known something, maybe not everything, but he had sensed the direction of things, and he had loved me enough to give me the only warning he had left the energy to give. If you've been watching this, and something in this story feels familiar to you, if you've felt this kind of quiet confusion, this slow, uncomfortable realization that something isn't quite right in your own family, I just want to say, you are not alone. A lot of us walk through these things in silence because we're ashamed or because we don't want to believe what we're beginning to see. If this story is reaching something in you, I hope it helps a little. And if you want to share what you're walking through, or just say where you're watching from, I read every single comment. Everyone. It means more than I can say to know that someone out there understands. If you haven't already, I'd be grateful if you subscribed. And if this moved you, please share it with someone who might need it. None of us should have to carry these things alone. I called Patricia Hess the next day. I told her everything: Michael's questions, Dana's call, the real estate friend waiting in the wings. Patricia listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Ruth, let me ask you something. Has Michael asked you to sign anything?" "He hadn't. Not yet." "Good," she said. "Don't sign anything without calling me first. Not one page." She explained some things to me that afternoon that I had not fully understood before. About the way estates sometimes get complicated when adult children have their own financial pressures. About how even good people, people who genuinely love their parents, can let need cloud their judgment. She wasn't telling me Michael was a criminal. She was telling me to be careful. She was telling me what Gerald had been trying to tell me with the last real breath he had. At Thanksgiving, Michael and Dana and the kids came to the house. I had decided to have it there, at home, because I wasn't ready to start building new traditions somewhere else. I cooked the things I always cooked: the sweet potato casserole Gerald loved, the green bean dish with the crispy onions on top, the apple pie from his mother's recipe that I had been making every November for 38 years. I set the table the same way I always had. I put Gerald's chair at the head of the table, and I didn't offer it to anyone, and no one asked. It was a good day, mostly. The grandchildren were the best part. Watching them run through the house, hearing their voices in the rooms, it kept the grief at a manageable distance. There were moments when I forgot, for just a second, that Gerald wasn't going to come in from the back porch. But at the end of the evening, after the kids were settled in front of the television and Dana had gone upstairs to make calls, Michael sat down across from me at the kitchen table and pulled a folder out of the bag he'd brought. "I had someone put together some information," he said, "just so you can see what we're looking at." Inside the folder was an appraisal, not from a licensed county appraiser, from his friend, the real estate agent. It had a number on it that was, I would later learn, about $40,000 below the actual market value of the house. There were also pages about something called a family trust transfer, language I didn't immediately understand, and a sheet comparing the costs of senior living communities in the area. I looked at all of it. I kept my face calm. Gerald used to say I had a good poker face when I needed one, and I needed one then. I thanked Michael for putting it together. I told him I would look it over carefully. I closed the folder and set it on the counter, and I changed the subject to the children, and the evening ended pleasantly enough. After they left, after I had washed the last dish and put away the last platter and turned off the kitchen light, I sat down in the living room in the dark for a long time. The house around me was so familiar, every creak, every shadow, the particular way the streetlight came through the front curtains. Gerald and I had bought this house when Michael was 4 years old. We had painted every room ourselves. Gerald had built the bookshelves in the study. We had argued and laughed and cried and celebrated in these rooms. My children had grown up inside these walls, and someone was trying to move me out of it. My son, my boy. I won't pretend that didn't break something in me. It did. Not a dramatic breaking, not the way you break in movies, falling apart spectacularly. Just a quiet, deep, adult kind of breaking. The kind that happens when something you believed about the world turns out not to be entirely true. I called Patricia the next morning and told her about the folder. She asked me to bring it in. I did. What she found, when she looked carefully at all of it, was not a crime. I want to be clear about that, because I don't want to tell this story unfairly. Michael had not forged anything. He had not stolen anything. What he had done was construct a picture, a careful, detailed, emotionally pressured picture, designed to make me feel that selling the house quickly and transferring a significant portion of the assets into a jointly held family trust was the only sensible and loving thing to do. The appraisal was low. The trust language was structured in a way that would have given Michael co-management authority over the proceeds. The senior living comparisons were, Patricia said, designed to make a capable woman feel less capable than she is. Patricia used the word manipulation. She said it quietly and without drama, the same way you'd say any true thing. I thought about Michael at the hospital, sitting by Gerald's bed. I thought about how attentive he'd been. I thought about whether any of that was real, and I still believe that most of it was. I think Michael loved his father. I think he loves me. I also think that somewhere along the way, financial pressure and his own anxieties, and perhaps some long-held ideas about what was his, had begun to reshape how he saw the situation. I don't think he woke up one morning and decided to be dishonest. I think it happened gradually, the way these things often do, in the quiet spaces between need and justification. But understanding how something happened doesn't mean you have to accept it. I wrote Michael a letter, not an email, a letter, on paper, because Gerald always said that anything important enough to say deserves the weight of paper. I wrote it over several days, thinking carefully about every sentence. I told him that I understood he was worried about me. I told him that I knew he had his own pressures, his own concerns for the future. I told him that I loved him and that I always would. And then I told him clearly, without anger, without cruelty, that I was not selling the house, that I was not entering into any shared financial arrangements without my attorney's involvement and full approval, that I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs and intended to do so, that if he wanted to be part of my life going forward, that was something I deeply wanted too, but that it would need to be built on honesty and on respect for the fact that this was my home, my life, and my decision to make. I sealed the letter and mailed it. He didn't call for almost 3 weeks after that. Those were hard weeks, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the silence. When your child doesn't call, there's a particular ache to it. You find yourself picking up the phone and putting it down again. You wonder if you said too much, or not enough, or the wrong things. You wonder if the relationship can survive being honest. Then one evening in December, the phone rang, and it was Michael. And he didn't say anything for a moment. And then he said, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Mum." He didn't say sorry for everything, and I didn't ask him to itemize it. He said he'd been feeling a lot of pressure, the mortgage on their house, Dana's mother needing care, things he hadn't told me about. He said he'd told himself he was helping me when maybe he was mostly helping himself. He said he thought Dad would have seen through it a lot sooner. I told him his father had. There was silence on the line. Then he said, "What do you mean?" And I told him. For the first time, I told him what Gerald had whispered to me 3 hours before he died. Michael didn't say anything for a long time. And then he said, in a voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy, "Dad knew me that well?" Yes, he did. That's what 40 years of quiet, honest love looks like. It learns a person. All of them, the best and the most complicated. We talked for over an hour that night. We cried, both of us, in that restrained way people in their 50s and their 60s cry, not the open weeping of children, but the tight, effortful kind that costs something. We didn't fix everything. These things don't get fixed in one phone call. But something shifted. Something that had been heading in a bad direction found a different road. Michael and Dana came to see me in January. We sat in the living room, my living room, in my house, where I intend to remain for as long as I am able, and we talked about real things. His finances, my needs, what help actually looks like, versus what help that serves someone else looks like. It wasn't easy, but it was real. The house still stands. The oak tree in the backyard still holds Gerald's bird feeder. In the spring, the cardinals come back, the same as they always have. And I sit by the window in the late afternoon the way Gerald used to, and I watch them, and I talk to him a little. I kept his crossword puzzles. I kept the mug in the drying rack for 4 more months, and when I finally put it away in the cabinet, not thrown away, just put away where I could reach it, it felt like something I chose to do, instead of something that was happening to me. That's what I want to leave you with. If you're sitting somewhere watching this, and you recognize something in this story, grief makes us vulnerable. It's supposed to. That vulnerability is part of love, the price of it. But vulnerable doesn't have to mean powerless. It doesn't mean you have to sign things you don't understand, or sell things you're not ready to sell, or make decisions before you've had time to breathe. Gerald couldn't protect me from what was coming. He was too sick, and too tired, and too close to the end. But he gave me the one thing he had left to give. He told me to pay attention. He told me, in the only way he could, that love sometimes requires us to be careful, even with the people we love most. I paid attention. I held on to what was mine. Not just the house, not just the money, though those things matter, and I don't want to pretend they don't. I held on to myself, my judgment, my dignity, the right to move through my own grief at my own pace, in my own home, on my own terms. And I genuinely believe that somewhere Gerald knows that, and that he's sitting by some window, watching some beautiful ordinary thing, and he is at peace. I am still learning how to be, but I am learning, and some days that is enough.